Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe my channel. The probate courtroom smelled like old paper furniture polish, and the bitter metallic chill of overworked air conditioning, and the fluorescent lights flattened everything into hard edges. The mahogany rail, the brass microphone stem, the glossy exhibit boards propped beside my father's table. My father, Roland Kincaid, stood with one hand tucked into the pocket of his navy suit and the other lifted toward me as if he were presenting a damaged product to the court. My stepmother, Celeste, sat beside him in cream silk, one pearl-tipped fingernail tapping the lid of her legal pad in a steady, impatient rhythm. My half-brother Graham leaned back in his chair with his ankle over his knee, grinning at the ceiling like he'd already won. Their attorney, Preston Vale, slid a stack of enlarged text messages across the counsel table with the careful little flourish of a magician setting up his favorite trick. The court reporter paused with her fingers hovering above the machine. 3 rows behind me, strangers from my father's firm and 2 women from Celeste's charity board craned their necks to get a better look. Then my father laughed and said, loud enough for every person in that room to hear, "She's not here for justice, Your Honor. She's here because she finally realized she can't bill grief by the hour." A few people actually smiled. My name is Lydia Eleanor Devereux. I'm 32. And this is the story of how I let my father mock me in court so he would walk straight into the trap that destroyed everything he'd built on my mother's grave. I didn't look at the gallery. I didn't look at Celeste or Graham or the women whispering behind me. I kept my eyes on the judge because the judge was the only person in that room whose opinion mattered, and because panic is contagious if you let other people see it. The muscles in my jaw felt tight enough to crack, but my voice when it came was level. "Is counsel finished with the performance?" I said calmly, "or should I wait until everyone has had their laugh?" Preston Vale straightened. "Your Honor, let the record reflect that the petitioner continues to respond with hostility." My father gave a small shrug, palms open, the picture of wounded civility. "I've tried for years to help my daughter. What you're seeing now is obsession. Since my mother-in-law's death, Lydia has convinced herself she's entitled to assets that do not belong to her." He nodded toward the exhibit board, where a blown-up printout showed a message thread with my name at the top and a series of increasingly ugly texts underneath. Demands. Threats. One line about taking what was mine one way or another. Another about making the family pay in public. The texts were fake. Not fake in the crude, obvious way most people imagine. These were polished. Timestamps aligned. Formatting clean. Just plausible enough to make a room full of strangers lean 1 inch away from me. Preston cleared his throat and continued. "The respondent has also submitted a packet showing a pattern of harassment, repeated contact with staff, and what appears to be an attempt to use the Devereux family name to pressure trust administrators." Celeste made a soft, sorrowful face and lowered her eyes at exactly the right moment. Graham smirked into his fist. My father tilted his head toward me with the kind of pity that had made people trust him for 30 years. "If she were just angry," he said, "that would be one thing. But this fixation on the Devereux estate has become unstable." That word landed exactly where he wanted it to. Unstable. My mother had been called that before she died. My grandmother had been called that the year before the conservatorship petition mysteriously appeared. And now, right on schedule, I was unstable too. I could feel the room settling around the story he had prepared for me. It moved over the benches and the counsel tables and the polished wood like a sheet being drawn over furniture. Wealthy father. Troubled daughter. Dead grandmother. Inheritance delusion. People love familiar narratives. They don't have to think very hard inside them. The judge, Malcolm Sayer, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents in front of him. He was a narrow man in his 60s with silver hair, a careful mouth, and the kind of stillness that came from years of deciding whose version of reality would survive the day. His pen tapped once against the margin of my petition. "Miss Kincaid," he said. I lifted one finger. "Before the court addresses me, Your Honor, I'd like the record corrected." My father's smile thinned. The judge looked up. "Corrected in what respect?" I opened my folder, removed a certified copy of my birth certificate, and placed it on the podium with both hands. The paper made a dry, clean sound against the wood. "My legal name," I said evenly, "is Lydia Eleanor Devereux." The silence that followed was absolute. My father's expression didn't change right away. That was the first interesting thing. He assumed for just 1 second that I was being dramatic. Graham rolled his eyes. Celeste turned slightly in her chair, one brow lifting in faint annoyance, as if this were an embarrassing little flourish designed to waste time. Then Judge Sayer looked at me. Not glanced. Really looked. His pen stopped moving. His shoulders stiffened. The color in his face altered in a way so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. His eyes dropped to the certificate, then returned to me, then back down again. He reached for it with more care than the document required. "Approach," he said. Preston started to protest. "Your Honor." "Counsel." "Approach." I stepped forward. My father followed more slowly, irritation beginning to harden the corners of his mouth. Up close I could smell his cologne, cedar and pepper and money, the same scent that had hung on the coats in our front hall when I was a child waiting for him to come home from deals that always seemed more important than dinner. Judge Sayer read the document once, then again. Date of birth. I gave it to him. He looked at me for another 2 seconds, then shifted his gaze to my father. "Mr. Kincaid, did you notify this court that the petitioner's original maternal surname appears in the supplemental beneficiary language attached to the Devereux Preservation Trust?" For the first time that morning, Roland Kincaid looked caught off balance. It was small. Just a flicker. But it was there. Preston answered too fast. "Your Honor, the respondent was advised." "I do," he said. Something shifted in the room. Not fully. Not yet. But enough for the air to feel different in my lungs. Graham leaned forward. "This is ridiculous. She's using Grandma's last name to play dress up with a trust issue she doesn't understand." I turned to look at him for the first time that day. His tie was crooked. There was a pale crescent of sweat darkening the collar of his blue shirt. He had always perspired when he lied, and it always made him angry that his body betrayed him. "You're right about one thing," I said quietly. "I understand more than you think." Celeste's fingers stopped tapping. My father's jaw flexed once. Judge Sayer ordered a 10-minute recess and took the birth certificate with him. The gallery erupted the second he disappeared through the side door. Whispering. Chairs scraping. The sound was sharp and insect-thin under the fluorescent lights. Preston leaned in so close to my father their shoulders nearly touched. Celeste whispered something without moving her lips. Graham threw me a look that was meant to be contemptuous and landed somewhere closer to anxious. My father came around the table toward me with that smooth, controlled stride he used whenever he wanted to remind people he owned the floor beneath their shoes. He stopped just inside my space, close enough that anyone watching would think it was intimacy instead of threat. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. I capped my pen. "Standing. Don't be clever. I'm not the one who brought enlarged fake texts into a courtroom." His nostrils flared. "You have no idea what you're playing with." I slid the pen into my folder and met his eyes. "That's the line you use when you think someone is about to stop being convenient." His smile came back, but it looked painted on now. Still dramatic. Still stealing. For a second the silence between us felt thin as glass. Then Celeste appeared at his elbow, resting her hand lightly on his sleeve as if calming an agitated horse. Up close, her lipstick was a shade too warm for her skin, and there was a tiny crack in the powder near her left nostril. "Roland," she murmured, "not here." Graham came next, his movements faster, sharper. "Dad, let Preston handle it." Preston himself crossed the aisle with a legal folder tucked under his arm. He gave me the kind of smile men like him reserve for women they mistake for emotional liabilities. "Miss Devereux, if that's what we're calling you this week, I strongly advise you not to compound a weak filing with theatrics." I looked at his cuff links. Gold knots. Monogrammed. Expensive but not original money. Men born outside power often over-accessorize once they get close enough to smell it. "Your office server ends in 7.143, doesn't it?" I asked. His expression stalled. Only for an instant. But it stalled. "Excuse me." "The IP address embedded in the message exports," I said, still calm. "The ones your team submitted this morning. They resolved to a block assigned to Kincaid Vale Holdings." Graham straightened so abruptly his chair legs scraped. Celeste's hand slipped off my father's sleeve. Preston's face didn't drain all at once. The color went in stages, like lights switching off floor by floor in a building after midnight. My father gave a short laugh. "You Googled some technical terms and decided to play investigator." "No," I said. "I hired one." He held my stare. I held it back. A bailiff walked past us carrying a stack of files, and the stale courthouse air moved just enough to lift the edge of the exhibit board behind my father's shoulder. Preston recovered first. If you have objections to authenticity, counsel may raise them through proper channels. I already did, I said. Along with a motion to compel a forensic preservation order, a metadata analysis of the altered messages, and a sealed affidavit from the cyber unit that traced the edits to 2 devices. One belonged to your paralegal. The other belonged to Graham. Graham barked a laugh that was almost a cough. That's insane. Is it? Dad. Roland didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on me and the warmth had gone out of them completely. I knew that look. It was the one he used when negotiations failed and demolition began. You've always confused access with leverage, he said. And you've always confused silence with ignorance. The courtroom door opened. Judge Sayer returned and every voice in the room died at once. We resumed our places. I stood at the podium. My father sat more rigidly now, one ankle locked over the other so tightly the leather of his shoe creaked when he shifted. Celeste had both hands folded on the table. Graham had stopped performing ease and started licking the inside of his cheek. Preston kept turning his pen between his fingers. Judge Sayer settled into his chair and looked directly at Preston. Counsel, the court has reviewed the petitioner's supplemental filing submitted at 8:12 this morning. It includes forensic objections to your exhibits, a request for immediate preservation, and reference to a sealed beneficiary schedule attached to the original Devereux Preservation Trust. Preston stood. Your Honor, we had no opportunity to review that material before today. Perhaps, Judge Sayer said, you should have spent less time printing giant poster boards. A sound moved through the gallery and died quickly. My father rose. Your Honor, with respect, this is an old family matter being inflated into a procedural spectacle. My daughter is attempting to weaponize her grandmother's name because she's angry. Judge Sayer turned toward him. Mr. Kincaid, the moment your counsel submitted evidence of alleged extortion, harassment, and instability, it stopped being a family matter. My father opened his hands again. Then let's discuss facts. Gladly, I said that he looked at me, annoyed now that I had answered too quickly. Judge Sayer nodded once. I opened the folder in front of me and removed 3 tabs, laying them out one by one on the podium in deliberate sequence. Blue, gray, white. My hands were steady. That steadiness, more than anything I said, unsettled them. People like my father always expect either rage or collapse. Calm feels unnatural to them. It gives them nowhere to push. The message thread submitted by the respondent, I said, was altered on March 14 at 11:48 p.m. through a desktop assigned to Preston Vale's office. The original conversation contains no threats. It contains 2 requests for an accounting, 1 demand for copies of trust amendments, and 1 sentence stating I would seek judicial relief if the documents were withheld. Preston snapped, that is false. I lifted the gray tab. This is the authenticity report from Holland Data Forensics. Chain of custody attached. Their analyst is prepared to testify. The judge extended his hand to the bailiff who carried the document up. I lifted the white tab. Second, the photographs submitted as evidence that I was loitering outside Kincaid offices were taken by a private security contractor retained by my father 2 days after I sent a formal preservation request. The contractor, Mr. Emil Torres, has already confirmed under affidavit that he was instructed to create the impression I was stalking staff. Graham muttered, Jesus. My father's head snapped toward him, then back to me. I placed the blue tab last. Third, and most important, the Devereux Preservation Trust was never superseded in the manner the respondent claims. The 2018 amendment removing me as beneficiary is ensigned on page 4, uses notarial language from a commission that had already expired, and routes distributions through a shell entity called Redmere Coastal Holdings. Judge Sayer looked up. And who controls Redmere Coastal Holdings? I let one breath pass before answering. My father. If silence could change temperature, it did then. The air in that courtroom went cold. Celeste's lips parted. Graham turned fully toward Preston. Preston stared at the table. My father remained very still, which was always his first defense. When cornered, lesser men fidget. Roland Kincaid became marble. That accusation is outrageous, he said. Actually, I replied, it's accounting. He looked at me as if he could peel the skin off language and find the frightened child he used to control inside it. You don't know what those entities are for. I know enough to subpoena Redmir's books, the trust distributions, the conservatorship correspondence, and the surveillance contracts you paid from operating funds. Preston stood so quickly his chair bumped backward. Your Honor, this is not an evidentiary hearing. Judge Sayer didn't even blink. No. But it may become one very quickly. I took a slow sip of water from the paper cup beside the podium. That tiny pause, that deliberate ordinary movement, cut through the room harder than any shouted accusation could have. My father noticed. Graham noticed. Preston noticed. The fact that I wasn't scrambling, wasn't pleading, wasn't improvising, that was the first moment they understood this hadn't started today. Judge Sayer set the documents down and spoke with the careful precision of a man building a staircase in open air. The court is issuing an immediate preservation order as to all trust records, amendments, digital communications, surveillance contracts, and financial transfers connected to the Devereux Preservation Trust and any related holding entities. A full evidentiary hearing is set for next Thursday at 9 a.m. in chambers pending review of the sealed supplemental materials. My father's composure cracked by half a degree. In chambers? Yes. With respect, I'd prefer public proceedings. I almost smiled. Judge Sayer folded his hands. I didn't ask. Celeste inhaled sharply. Graham rubbed both palms over his face. Preston started whispering to my father, fast and tight and useless. Then the judge looked at me again. Miss Devereux, ensure your counsel is prepared. She already is, I said. My father frowned. Counsel. The courtroom doors opened. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped inside as if the building had been waiting for her. Naomi Mercer didn't move quickly. She moved with the sort of contained efficiency that makes everyone else look theatrical by comparison. Her dark hair was pinned low at the nape of her neck. She carried a slim leather case and no visible anxiety. She walked straight to me, placed one hand on the table and said, "Sorry I'm late." The bank's compliance officer was more cooperative than expected. Preston turned fully around. Naomi. Naomi gave him the smallest possible nod. Preston. She set 2 additional filings on the table. One was for the court. One was for opposing counsel. The emergency motion is supplemented, she said. And yes, before you ask, we copied your ethics carrier. The sound Graham made then was almost funny. My father stared at Naomi, then at me. You hired Mercer? No, I said. My grandmother did. She just arranged for me to find out. That landed harder than anything else I'd said. As it was the truth. 3 months before the hearing, I had found a letter tucked inside the false bottom of a rosewood jewelry box in my grandmother Vivian Devereux's dressing room, beneath old cuff bracelets and a packet of yellowed opera tickets. The note was written in her precise blue ink and sealed in an envelope so brittle it cracked at the fold when I opened it. If you are reading this, Lydia, it had said, then Roland has finally forced your hand. Call Naomi Mercer. Do not tell anyone. And use your proper name. My father didn't know about the letter. He didn't know the maid he fired last year had quietly handed me the jewelry box instead of sending it to auction with the rest of Vivian's estate. He didn't know Naomi had already spent 11 weeks assembling the kind of case that doesn't need drama because it has documents. He thought he was controlling the narrative because he always had. He thought he had my temper mapped like old property lines. What he didn't know was that I had spent the last 3 months letting him see exactly what I wanted him to see. The frantic calls from a decoy number. The emotional emails from an account I knew his IT consultant had access to. The unannounced visits to his office lobby, timed precisely to trigger the surveillance he would later try to weaponize. I gave him a woman on the verge because men like him rush toward predictable weakness the way gamblers rush toward rigged tables. They thought they had evidence of instability. What they really had was a trail of fingerprints. The next Thursday the confrontation moved upstairs. Judge Sayer's chambers weren't ornate in the theatrical way most people imagine. No carved eagles. No velvet curtains. But the room had the unmistakable weight of authority. Dark walnut paneling. 2 walls of built-in shelves with leather-bound volumes faded at the spines. A broad conference table polished to a low glow under recessed amber lights. The windows faced the river, and the morning sun hit the glass towers across the water so they flashed like blades. Even the air felt denser there, muted by thick carpet and years of closed-door decisions. My father arrived first. That, more than anything, told me he was rattled. Roland Kincaid was a man who understood the theater of timing. He liked entering rooms just late enough to make people wait, just early enough to claim he had been patient. But when I walked into chambers with Naomi, he was already seated, shoulders square, a legal pad centered precisely in front of him. Preston sat at his right, pale and over-ironed. Celeste was there too, in a slate-gray dress with a high collar that made her look severe and expensive and tired. Graham stood by the window pretending to read emails, his reflection trembling faintly in the glass. They all looked smaller than they had the week before. Not physically. Structurally. Like a scaffolding had been removed overnight and no one had told them they were already leaning. Naomi took the seat beside me and laid out our binders in a clean row, red, black, silver, cream. She believed in visual order. Not for aesthetics. For dominance. Chaos makes weak people feel busy and powerful people feel disrespected. Order makes everyone understand there is a sequence coming whether they like it or not. A forensic accountant named Daniel Cho joined us 2 minutes later. Short, neat, rimless glasses, expression as readable as a sealed envelope. He carried 2 banker's boxes and a laptop case. Behind him came a clerk with a cart of additional files. My father's eyes narrowed. All this for a trust accounting. Naomi sat down without looking at him. No. The accounting is the easy part. Judge Sayer entered with a retired special master named Alan Brooke and closed the door himself. That small act, the judge personally closing the door, landed in the room with the finality of a lock. We are on the record for purposes of settlement authority, evidentiary review and preservation compliance, he said. I will hear the petitioner's timeline first. Naomi stood. What I admired about Naomi was that she never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her confidence wasn't performance. It was architecture. She moved through facts the way a surveyor moves through land. Measuring, marking, making ownership visible. Your Honor, she began, this matter is not a simple inheritance dispute. It is a 14-year pattern of diversion, concealment, document manipulation and coercive control centered on assets originally placed in the Devereux Preservation Trust for the benefit of Lydia Eleanor Devereux. She clicked the remote in her hand. A screen at the end of the room lit up. The first slide was a date. August 17, 2012. The day my mother died. The room went still. Naomi continued. Following the death of Eleanor Devereux Kincaid, the respondent, Roland Kincaid, assumed temporary administrative control over certain trust communications while the beneficiary, then 18, was enrolled out of state. Within 6 weeks he redirected correspondence to Kincaid and Vale, removed Devereux Family Council from routine notice chains, and began treating trust-related distributions as management reserves. Daniel opened the first banker's box and handed out folders. Thick, tabbed, ugly with truth. I didn't look at my father. I watched Celeste instead. She had married him 4 years after my mother died. I had spent years wondering how much she knew and years longer realizing that knowledge in people like Celeste doesn't always begin with facts. Sometimes it begins with comfort. With a nicer house. With new jewelry. With the relief of not asking difficult questions. As Naomi spoke, Celeste's posture tightened in stages. She kept her chin lifted, but her thumb started rubbing over the side of her wedding ring. The next date appeared. February 3, 2015. On that date, Naomi said, Mr. Kincaid caused Redmere Coastal Holdings to be formed. Within 90 days, trust distributions intended for property preservation and beneficiary education expenses began flowing through Redmere accounts before disbursement. That alone would require explanation. It becomes more serious when compared against maintenance invoices, capital calls and internal expense memos. Daniel slid printed spreadsheets across the table. Columns. Account numbers. Wire references. Tiny squares of ruin. Graham leaned over my father's shoulder. This doesn't prove anything. Daniel finally spoke, his tone almost gentle. Actually, it proves sequence. Which is usually enough. Naomi clicked again. June 11, 2018. The respondent now claims this date reflects a valid amendment disinheriting Ms. Devereux due to alleged instability and harassment. We contend the amendment is forged, backdated, and unsupported by any competent review. Preston's chair squeaked as he shifted. Objection to the term forged. Judge Sayer didn't take his eyes off the screen. Noted. Naomi nodded to Daniel, who opened the black binder and removed 2 notarized pages. The notary commission on the contested amendment had expired 12 days before the document was executed, Daniel said. In addition, the signature block contains pressure variations inconsistent with the decedent's known writing pattern during that period, and page 4 uses a printer model not sold domestically until the following year. Graham stared. Celeste turned to Preston with genuine alarm for the first time. My father remained motionless, but a pulse had appeared in his temple. Naomi went on. That would already be sufficient for a civil challenge. It becomes criminal when paired with the conservatorship petition filed against Vivian Devereux 11 months earlier. That landed. Because the conservatorship was the buried thing. Filled shame. The private attempt to declare my grandmother impaired after she started questioning why her property tax reserves were being drained by entities she didn't recognize. My father had dismissed it for years as a necessary protective measure. Family stress. Elder confusion. Administrative housekeeping. Naomi placed a certified copy on the table. The petition cited confusion, erratic spending, and deteriorating memory. Yet on the same week it was filed, Vivian Devereux attended 2 board meetings, dictated correspondence to 3 separate institutions, and signed a 6-page memorandum demanding a full audit of Redmere Coastal Holdings. Judge Brooke looked at my father over the rim of her glasses. Did you file for conservatorship against your mother-in-law after she requested an audit of accounts you controlled? Roland answered before Preston could stop him. She was becoming paranoid. I spoke for the first time in 10 minutes. She was becoming specific. His head turned toward me so sharply I heard the faint crackle of his collar. The next slide appeared. March 14, 2026. The fake texts. The surveillance. Last Thursday. Naomi's voice stayed flat. When the petitioner renewed requests for accounting after Vivian Devereux's death, the respondent escalated from concealment to preemptive discrediting. Altered text chains were created. Surveillance was commissioned. Informal communications were preserved selectively to build a portrait of obsession. We believe the goal was simple. If Ms. Devereux appeared unstable enough, any future challenge could be dismissed as grief, entitlement, or revenge. Preston sat back like he'd been struck in the chest. My father exhaled through his nose. This is a story. Not proof. Naomi turned. Then let's move to proof. She signaled Daniel again. He opened the silver binder and removed an audio transcript. 2 weeks ago, Naomi said, our office received corroboration from a witness previously employed by Kincaid and Vale. The witness provided meeting notes, duplicate storage logs, and a recorded conversation from the respondent's office. Celeste whispered, "What witness?" Naomi didn't answer her. She pressed a key. The room filled with sound. At first it was just paper moving, a chair creaking, ice in a glass. Then Preston's voice, unmistakable and irritated. "If she files before we're ready, the old messages won't be enough. We need her to look erratic, not just persistent." Then Graham, lower and sharper than I had ever heard him in public. "I can get into the account again." Then my father. "Do it cleanly this time. And if Claire asks questions, keep her out of it." No one moved. The recording continued for another 20 seconds. Enough to establish intent. Enough to show coordination. Enough to make denial look stupid. Naomi stopped the playback. The silence afterward had weight. It settled over the walnut table and the legal pads and the coffee cups like dust after a collapse. Celeste's face had gone nearly white. Graham stepped backward until he hit the window ledge behind him. Preston took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, buying time the way frightened men do when they can't buy silence anymore. My father was still looking at the speaker on the table. He did not ask if it was real. That was the second interesting thing. Instead he said very carefully, "Who gave you that?" Naomi turned a page. "Before we get there, I'd like the court to note that the respondent has not denied the authenticity of the voices." Preston finally found his voice. "This is extortionate ambush litigation. If your client thinks she can pressure a settlement by parading privileged office chatter." "Privileged," Judge Sayer said, "does not cover conspiracy." Preston shut his mouth. Naomi nodded toward the clerk by the door. "Please bring in Ms. Donnelly." When Claire Donnelly entered the room, Graham made a sound of pure disbelief. Claire had worked for my father since I was 9. She was the person who knew where every contract lived, which judge preferred hard copies, which client lied about travel delays, and where the good bourbon was hidden when men with donor lists stayed late. She was in her late 50s now, compact and composed, with chestnut hair cut just below the jaw and a spine so straight it made everyone around her correct their posture. In every family photograph from charity dinners and office galas, she had hovered 2 steps behind the visible power, carrying a tray, a coat, a set of keys, a file. Invisible women see everything. Claire sat, folded her hands over a slim blue notebook and met no one's eyes except the judge's. Judge Sayer administered a limited oath for purposes of sealed review. Claire answered in a voice so steady it made my skin prickle. Yes, I worked for Mr. Kincaid for 23 years. Yes, I managed physical archives and calendars. Yes, I retained copies of storage logs after discrepancies arose between trust paperwork and what was actually being moved off-site. Yes, I recognized my own notary stamp on a draft amendment I never notarized. At that, Preston actually lurched forward. You're saying someone forged your seal? Claire turned to him at last. I'm saying someone used it after I reported it missing. Graham muttered, this is insane. Claire looked at him with the bland exhaustion of a woman who has watched a spoiled boy age into an entitled man without improving at all. No, Graham. Insane was watching you all think no one in that office could read. My father's voice changed then. Not louder. Harder. Claire. She didn't flinch. Be very careful. It was such an old sentence. Such a practiced one. It had bent entire rooms for him before. It had bent me once. Claire reached into her bag, removed a second notebook and placed it on the table. I was careful, she said. That's why I kept duplicates. Naomi took over. Ms. Donnelly began copying storage logs in 2021 after Mr. Kincaid instructed staff to relocate archived Devereux files without standard inventory notation. In January of this year, he directed her to prepare backdated correspondence suggesting Vivian Devereux had voluntarily relinquished certain beneficiary notices. Judge Brooke leaned forward. Did you prepare those letters? No. Why not? Claire's eyes flicked once briefly toward me. Because Eleanor Devereux paid for my son's rehabilitation after his accident when no one else in that office would even take my calls. And because I knew if this ever blew up they were going to put it on me. There was the reason. Not sudden conscience. Not melodrama. Memory. Debt. Survival. The clean math of a woman realizing she was being positioned beneath falling stone. My father laughed once, short and contemptuous. So now we're rewriting history based on the wounded loyalty of a disgruntled employee. Claire turned to him fully. No, Roland. I'm correcting the record based on copies you were too arrogant to think I'd make. Naomi let that settle for exactly the right amount of time. Then she laid out the rest of the sequence. The archived removal orders signed under Redmir's authority. The property maintenance invoices billed twice. The tuition reserve disbursements never sent. The email from my father directing Graham to let her keep using the Devereux name if it makes baiting her easier. The draft press statement prepared in advance in case I filed publicly, describing me as emotionally volatile and estranged due to long-standing behavioral concerns. Celeste read that page and actually recoiled. Her hand went to her throat. She looked at my father not like a wife discovering betrayal in theory, but like a woman finally seeing the contour of the machine she had married into. You wrote this, she said. My father didn't answer. You were going to say that about her publicly. Celeste, he said quietly, now is not the time. Her laugh was thin and ugly. No. I think it's exactly the time. And just like that the fracture line opened. Graham turned on Preston first. You told us the amendment would hold. Preston snapped back. I told you it needed proper execution and you insisted on speed. I insisted because Graham jabbed a finger at my father, said she was getting close. My father stood. Enough. Judge Sayer's voice cut across the room. Sit down. Roland did not sit immediately. That hesitation cost him more than if he'd shouted. Men who make careers out of command cannot afford to look like they're deciding whether a judge still outranks them. He sat. Celeste had gone very still. What else don't I know? No one answered her. So she answered herself. She turned to Graham. The condo in Palm Beach. Was that from Redmere? Graham looked away. It was almost elegant the way the whole family began collapsing into its own truths. One thread tugged, then another, then another. Years of coordinated posture breaking in public. The charity wife realizing the money had a name. The son realizing he had been protected only as long as he remained useful. The lawyer realizing indemnity language does not stop disgrace from climbing your front steps. My father sat in the middle of it all with his hands flat on the walnut table, staring straight ahead as if posture alone could keep consequence from recognizing him. Naomi waited until everyone was done performing shock. Then she delivered the part she had saved. The petitioner has no interest in theatrics, she said. She is prepared to proceed with a public evidentiary hearing, refer the matter to the district attorney's financial crimes unit, notify the state bar regarding fabricated submissions, and seek appointment of an independent receiver over all entities receiving trust-related transfers. Or she is prepared to resolve this today under terms already circulated. Daniel slid a packet down the table. A consent agreement. It required full restitution. A forensic accounting at the respondent's expense. Immediate transfer of controlling beneficiary rights. Withdrawal of the contested amendment. Preservation and turnover of all archives. Public retraction of the harassment allegations. Non-disparagement. Resignation from certain fiduciary roles. Cooperation with any future inquiry. It was not sentimental. It was clean. My father looked at the document and then finally at me. You planned this. I met his eyes. I planned to survive you. No, he said, and now there was something almost admiring in his anger which made it more grotesque. You wanted me to see it. I wanted you to see them, I said, glancing at the binders, the logs, the dates. I wanted you to see every document you thought you'd buried. Preston rubbed his forehead. Graham whispered something obscene. Celeste shut her eyes. My father leaned back and gave a brittle smile. You think a few files make you powerful? No, I replied. I think patterns do. Naomi spoke again. Mr. Kincaid, next time you decide to manufacture instability, make sure the woman you're framing doesn't have your office manager, your metadata, your shell company trail, and your son's voice on tape. Graham slammed a palm against the window ledge. I want separate counsel. So do I, Celeste said immediately. Preston stared at both of them as if they had just discovered gravity in the middle of a fall. This is not the moment to fragment. Judge Brooke folded her hands. On the contrary, fragmentation may be the most honest thing that has happened in this room. My father tried one last time to recover the center. Everyone calm down. We are not signing anything under threat. Naomi looked at him with almost clinical detachment. This isn't a threat. It's a schedule. She slid a second sheet forward. Public filing sequence. Bar complaint. Criminal referral. Bank notification. Board notification. Press hold statement. Even Graham looked sick reading it. I watched my father read each line. I watched him realize one item at a time that the old protections were gone. Reputation is a kind of currency, and he had spent his so recklessly over the years he no longer understood how quickly markets turn. Powerful men always think the first consequence will come from the thing they feared most. It almost never does. It comes from the small, practical people who stop returning calls. The banker who says compliance requires review. The donor who says perhaps we should wait. The club board that asks for quiet resignation to avoid attention. Shame rarely arrives through a front door. It seeps in through service entrances. He set the paper down. What do you want? He asked me. Not Naomi. Not the judge. Me. It was the first honest question he'd asked in years. I thought about answering with something sharp. Something memorable. But revenge has a cheap tone when it gets too verbal, and I hadn't come this far to sound theatrical. I want my mother's name taken out of your mouth, I said. I want every document returned. Every lie withdrawn. Every asset traced. And I want you to sign before lunch. Celeste looked at me then with something strange in her face. Not affection. Not apology. Recognition maybe. The stunned realization that the quiet daughter she had mistaken for decorative grief had become the only adult in the room. Judge Sayer checked his watch. You have 45 minutes. The next hour passed in clipped voices and the dry percussion of turning pages. Separate counsel were called. Additional carve-outs were negotiated. Graham insisted on language limiting personal admissions. Naomi agreed only to the extent it did not interfere with referrals. Celeste wanted release from future fiduciary exposure. Daniel had already separated her signatory authority from the entities where the real trouble lived. Preston tried twice to soften the retraction wording. Both times Naomi put the original language back. My father spoke less and less. At one point, when everyone else was bent over paper, he looked at me and said under his breath, "Your grandmother always did enjoy drama." I signed my initials beside a flagged paragraph and answered without looking up. She enjoyed records. His mouth twitched. Claire sat 3 chairs down, no longer invisible. Every so often Graham glanced at her with the dazed outrage of someone who cannot believe the furniture has testified. When the final signature pages were arranged, the room went very quiet again. There is a specific sound expensive pens make on thick paper. A soft drag. A whisper. Finality in satin shoes. Celeste signed first, her hand shaking only once. Graham signed hard enough to dent the page beneath. Preston signed as counsel with the face of a man calculating insurance coverage in real time. My father signed last. He used the same pen he had used to sign my school enrollment forms, my camp waivers, my mother's memorial guest book. The same measured flourish beneath the R. The same smug certainty in the shape of the final stroke. But when he set the pen down, his fingers remained on it for a second too long. Judge Sayer reviewed the pages, nodded to the clerk, and closed the file. "That concludes this matter for today," he said. "For today. Not forever." My father stood. So did I. For a brief second, we faced each other across the edge of the table that had just dismantled his version of our family. He looked older than he had that morning. Not ruined. Ruin takes time. But the first architecture of it had arrived. The eyes a little flatter. The shoulders carrying awareness instead of entitlement. The tiny strain around the mouth of a man who has just learned that charm does not function as a fire extinguisher. He said, "You'll regret making enemies out of blood." I picked up my copy of the agreement and slid it into my folder. "You taught me something useful," I said quietly. His expression hardened. "That a name is only worth the reputation behind it." Then I walked out. The next few weeks were paperwork, calls, courier envelopes, locked file rooms, and the beautiful monotony of systems correcting themselves when someone finally forces them to. There is nothing cinematic about restitution. It arrives in numbered accounts, amended ledgers, sworn inventory lists, notarized corrections, revised deeds, and overnight delivery receipts. Justice in real life often sounds like a scanner humming under fluorescent light. Naomi and I spent 3 straight afternoons in the Devereux Archives at Halston Fiduciary Services, a narrow building on Broad Street with black and white marble floors and brass directory plates that reflected our shoes in bent little fragments. We wore gloves. We opened acid-free boxes. We found letters from my mother, maintenance orders my grandmother had annotated in green ink, insurance schedules, education reserves, and one yellow folder labeled simply LED. Inside were copies of everything my father had spent 14 years pretending did not exist. Trust distributions meant for my graduate tuition that had been routed elsewhere. Property insurance advances rolled into holding accounts. My grandmother's memo requesting independent review. A private note from her to Naomi Mercer, dated 8 months before she died, stating, "If Roland moves against Lydia, assume concealment, not confusion." Reading that note under the cold white light of the archive room felt like having a hand rest briefly, firmly on my shoulder from the past. Outside the legal work, consequence began blooming in quieter places. First came the withdrawal. My father resigned from 3 boards for personal reasons within 10 days. Then the local paper ran a short item about leadership changes at Kincaid Urban Development. Then a second story, less short, about pending questions surrounding legacy trust administration. Then the bar opened a review. Then Redmare's bank requested internal documentation. Then 2 donors postponed a gala Celeste had spent 6 months organizing. Status doesn't fall all at once. It peels. 6 months later, I woke in an apartment my father had never entered. That mattered more than I expected it to. It was on the top floor of a renovated brick building south of Market Street, with wide plank oak floors, tall windows, matte black hardware, and a balcony that caught the first line of sun over the harbor. The kitchen counters were pale stone veined with gray, cool under my palms in the morning. My coffee maker hissed softly while the city woke below me. Delivery trucks, gulls, the distant clink of rigging from the marina, tires whispering over damp pavement. Light moved across the floor in long, clean bands, and for the first few weeks I kept noticing that no one in that space could enter without my permission. Freedom is often absurdly domestic. It's drinking coffee barefoot in your own kitchen and realizing your body has stopped listening for someone else's key in the door. I carried my mug onto the balcony and sat in a wrought iron chair with a cushion the color of river stone. The April air was cool enough to sting the inside of my nose. Below me, two women in running clothes laughed at something on a phone screen. A florist on the corner pulled metal shutters open with a rattle that echoed up the brick facades. Somewhere nearby, someone was making toast. That was the morning Claire called with the first real karma update. "You won't believe who I just saw," she said. I smiled before she finished. "Tell me." "Graham. At the DMV." I laughed into my coffee. "No driver," she said. "No assistant. No company SUV. Standing in line with everyone else holding one of those little paper tickets like it personally offended his ancestors." "What happened?" "License review tied to the development inquiry, apparently." He looked like a man being deported from his own reflection. That was Claire's gift. Her timing. Dry enough to wound, never messy enough to sound cruel. Graham's slide had been swift and embarrassingly ordinary. Once the books were opened, it turned out he had been signing off on disbursements he didn't understand because he assumed family money was safer than real money. His title at the development company evaporated into administrative leave, then into consulting ambiguity, then into nothing. One private club suspended him. Two creditors suddenly became less patient. The Palm Beach condo turned out to be leased through an entity tied to Redmere. He moved out under cover of a storm on a Tuesday and spent the next month trying to call people who had stopped admiring his last name. Celeste's fall was more social than financial, which in some circles is the same thing. No one escorted her dramatically out of any ballroom. No one wrote a public condemnation. It was smaller, colder. Invitations slowed. The women who used to lean close and kiss both cheeks began offering careful waves from across lobbies. Her charity gala was restructured, then reassigned. A photo spread for a home magazine vanished without explanation. By summer she was selling jewelry quietly through an appraiser on Meeting Street, and by autumn she had moved from the house on South Battery into a sleek rental with secure parking and no guest list. Once, 3 months after the signing, she sent me a message. I was at my desk when it arrived. Sunlight on the glass paperweight. Naomi's edits open on my screen. The little notification bar sliding down like it belonged there. "Lydia. I know I am the last person you want to hear from. But for what it's worth, I didn't know the extent of it. Not in the beginning. I read it once. Then I archived it without replying. That became one of my favorite private rituals. Don't answer. Threats, pleas, nostalgia, self-justification. It all went into digital cold storage. My father's messages grew different over time. The first ones were furious, formal, almost legal. Then indignant. Then paternal in a way that made my skin crawl. Then wistful. Men who lose power often try sentiment when intimidation stops working. They reach for memory because leverage has failed. One text from him read, "I miss the version of you who knew family mattered." I archived that one too. Another, "The house is not the same." Another, late at night. "Whatever you think I did to protect what your mother would have wanted." My mother had wanted sunlight, fig preserves on toast, opera on Sunday mornings, and a life without being managed. I knew that from her letters now. I knew that from the way my grandmother wrote about her. I knew that from scraps of memory my father had always treated like faulty witness testimony because they contradicted his script. Preston Vale did what lawyers like Preston always do when consequences stop being abstract. He hired his own lawyer, adopted a look of stunned professionalism, and started speaking in phrases like regrettable procedural irregularities. It didn't help. The ethics review took his summer. Then his fall. Then most of his client list. By winter he had stepped down from the partnership he'd spent 2 decades clawing toward. There were rumors he was teaching continuing education seminars to accountants in Hilton Head. There are fates more humiliating, I suppose. But not many that fit so neatly. As for my father, the collapse was slower and therefore more satisfying. He wasn't arrested in handcuffs on courthouse steps. Life is rarely that tidy. But he was removed from every formal fiduciary role tied to Devereux assets. His firm pushed him into temporary medical leave, then strategic transition, then silence. 2 long-standing clients moved their business. A third requested file review. His bar matter didn't explode publicly at first. It smoldered, which is worse in some ways. Public scandal gives people a script. Smoldering inquiry makes everyone imagine their own version of your guilt. The house on South Battery, the one with the iron gate, the limestone foyer, and the view of the water he always said proved he had made it, went on the market in October with no family announcement. The listing photos were all polished stone and neutral upholstery and no evidence that anyone had ever raised a child there badly. I saved the listing anyway. Not because I wanted the house. Because it was evidence that even some victories have to be packed into boxes. My own life looked nothing like theirs by then. I had leased a small office with 3 tall windows above a stationery shop, where the afternoon light turned the floorboards amber and the radiator hissed in winter like it had opinions. I named the firm Devereux Advisory, not out of sentiment but precision. We specialized in trust review, legacy asset tracing, and quiet pre-litigation strategy for people who had been told family money was too complicated for them to understand. Widows, daughters, quiet sons, former spouses, adult beneficiaries with that particular hollow look I recognized instantly, the look of people who have spent years being told they were emotional whenever they asked for records. Turns out survival is highly transferable. So are pattern recognition and a tolerance for expensive lies. I didn't become vindictive. I became efficient. There was a woman from Atlanta whose brother had been siphoning preservation funds from a family ranch under the language of deferred maintenance. A man from Richmond whose stepfather had buried tuition reserves beneath 3 LLCs and a renovation budget. A woman from Naples who had never been given copies of the trust her name appeared in. I sat across from them in the office with the oak desk and the brass reading lamp and the white ceramic cups I bought because they felt solid in my hands, and I said things no one had said to me soon enough. Ask for the original. Get the metadata. Do not tell them what you know before you've documented what they've done. And my personal favorite, calm down later. Naomi sent over referrals she didn't want to litigate herself. Daniel handled the forensic accounting side on contract 2 days a week. Claire, after 23 years of keeping men like my father organized, agreed to run operations for me with the dry caveat that she was done pretending incompetence was charisma. Our office ran on spreadsheets, sealed cartons, quiet competence, and excellent coffee. One afternoon in late summer, Claire leaned in my doorway holding a stack of intake forms and said, "You know your father tried to book a consult." I looked up from my laptop. With me. With the website intake form, yes. She handed me the printed page. Used his middle initial. As though that would fool anyone. I read it. Legal issue summary. Reputational fallout stemming from family dispute, hostile mischaracterization by former beneficiary, possible breach of confidentiality. I laughed so hard I had to set the paper down. What did you do? Claire's mouth twitched. Archived it. Of all the things I lost that year, naivete was the only one I missed occasionally, and even then not for long. There is something undeniably peaceful about no longer needing other people to be better than they are. It saves a remarkable amount of energy. I still had people, though. That mattered too. Naomi, who pretended not to enjoy my victory and absolutely did. Claire, who brought cut flowers from the market every Monday and knew which clients needed tea instead of coffee. Daniel, who once described a particularly sloppy embezzlement chain as financial glitter, and made me laugh so unexpectedly I cried. And, strangely, Elena March. When I first met Elena, she was on my father's arm at a donor dinner 8 months before the hearing, all bronze silk and impossible posture, younger than him by 15 years and wearing the practiced smile of a woman who knows exactly how much a room expects her to tolerate. She had looked at me that night with cool dismissal, as if I were a family inconvenience with a habit of lingering too close to the champagne. I had filed her under ornamental threat and thought no more about it. Then 2 months after the settlement, I ran into her at a bookstore cafe on King Street. It was raining. The windows were blurred with water. The cafe smelled like wet wool, espresso, and paper. She was standing by the counter in a camel coat, stirring honey into tea with the slow concentration of someone rebuilding herself from the inside out. She saw me, went still, and then did the last thing I expected. She walked over and said, "I owe you an apology." We sat by the window at a round marble table while rain threaded down the glass. She told me she had left my father within a week of the signing. She told me he had lied to her about everything that mattered and had already started doing to her what he had done to every woman in his orbit. Isolating facts, reframing reactions, turning doubt into leverage. She told me she had almost married him because charisma is easiest to mistake for safety when it arrives wearing certainty. She didn't ask for absolution. That was what made me listen. After that, we had coffee sometimes. Not often at first. Then enough that it stopped being strange. Friendship is not always born from affinity. Sometimes it is born from surviving the same weather from different windows. That winter, as the city dressed itself in cold blue evenings and holiday lights strung across narrow streets, Elena called me from outside a gallery opening and said, laughing, "You're not going to believe this." Celeste tried to pretend she didn't know me and then asked if I'd heard from Roland. "What did you say?" "That I make it a policy not to collect damaged antiques." I nearly drove off the road laughing. She came by the office the next day with pastries. By then, the criminal side had become what criminal matters usually become for families like mine. Less cinematic than feared, more expensive than expected, and extremely unpleasant for the people who assumed private misconduct would remain private forever. My father's counsel fought language, sequencing, and scope. There were interviews, productions, supplemental requests. He wasn't marched away. He was worn down. Reputation stripped in layers. Influence translated into invoices instead of immunity. Which to me felt appropriate. One November evening, Claire leaned against my office door after everyone else had left and said, "Have you heard? Roland's trying to sell the club membership through a proxy." I looked up from the memo I was reviewing. "Can he do that?" "No. That feels on brand." She nodded. "Very." Then she softened in a way she rarely did. "Your mother would have liked this office, you know." I went still. Claire looked around at the brass lamp, the stacked case files, the wool rug, the clean shelves, the bowl of clementinas on the credenza because I liked color in winter. "Not the circumstances," she added. "But the order. The light." I swallowed once before answering. "Thank you." That night I stayed late after everyone left and sat alone in the darkening office while the street lamps came on one by one below the window. For a long time I listened to the radiator ticking and thought about inheritance. Not money. Not property. Texture. Gesture. Tone. What survives one woman in the habits of another. My mother's handwriting. My grandmother's insistence on records. My own quiet refusal to be rushed once I understood what rushing had cost us. By the time spring came again, the sharpest part of the story had already passed. That's what no one tells you about justice. The climax is brief. The real reward is the morning after, and the morning after that, and all the ordinary mornings that follow when your life begins to belong to you in repetitions instead of headlines. That evening, almost a year to the day after the first hearing, I stood on my balcony with a glass of wine in one hand and the city opening into dusk below me. The sky over the harbor was layered in orange and rose and a blue so deep it looked poured rather than painted. The windows in the buildings across the water caught the last light and held it for a minute before letting it go. Down on the street, headlights started threading through intersections. Somewhere a saxophone was playing badly and earnestly from an open courtyard. The air smelled like jasmine climbing the brick wall below my balcony and the faint salt of the river moving in. Elena was with me, barefoot despite the chill, leaning on the iron railing with her glass lifted toward the sunset. A year earlier she had been one more polished figure in my father's orbit. Another woman I assumed saw me as an inconvenience. Now she was telling me with dry horror about a man she had recently declined to date because he described himself as entrepreneurial adjacent. I laughed. "That's not a profession." "No," she said, clinking her glass lightly against mine. "It's a warning label." We stood there smiling into the orange glow like two women who had finally aged out of being impressed by expensive lies. She lifted her glass again. "To records." I smiled. "To records." Then after a beat I added, "To women who keep copies." Her laugh floated out over the balcony rail and down into the evening. From inside my phone lit up once on the kitchen counter. A message. Unknown number. I didn't move to check it. I already knew the genre. Apology. Blame. Memory. Need. The past always wants one more conversation after it loses the right to narrate you. The city darkened by degrees. The orange softened into ember. Windows became constellations. Somewhere below, someone opened a restaurant door and a burst of warm garlic and music drifted upward before the street swallowed it again. Elena went inside to refill our glasses. I stayed at the railing for a moment longer with my hand resting on the cool iron and the last light touching the backs of my fingers. A year earlier, I had walked into court carrying a folder so tightly my hands went numb, while my father tried to turn my composure into evidence against me. I had still been partly the woman he raised. Careful, watchful, too willing to mistake endurance for peace. I had believed somewhere deep down that if I explained myself well enough, the right people would eventually understand.